I am here with Susan Lowell de Solórzano. Susan, welcome to the podcast.
John, thanks so much for having me on.
So, biotensegrity, that word is not yet in common usage. In fact, when I type it, I keep getting a spell check error. Uh, so, what is biotensegrity?
I have to break it up a tiny bit. Biotensegrity is looking at tensegrity as a useful framework for understanding biology. So the bio is the biology. But then that brings us to the question, what is tensegrity? And tensegrity is a way of putting stuff together, building something, making something volumetric that is an innovation only of the last approximately 100 years. So if you think of it, people have been building things brick on a brick, stone on a stone for hundreds of thousands of years. About 100 years ago, at most, maybe more like 75 years ago, humans came up with another way of building volumetric structures using sticks and strings, rods and cables. They can be really huge when we build them with our hands, sticks and strings, such that the push and the pull in the system is in a sort of win-win balanced relationship. And so you hold these structures, you pull two sticks apart, and all the sticks move away from each other. You push two sticks together, and all of the sticks move closer together. And this confused everybody. It confused me when I first built one. The mathematicians looked at these tensegrity structures and said, okay, there's a whole new area of math here that we don't understand. So these are really new structures. And so it's a very, very new paradigm for understanding the possibilities of any physical structure and the energetic relationships of push and pull within them. And we theorize, we who are studying biotensegrity, we theorize that that is what's going on in all biological systems, which historically, in biomechanics and such, have been modeled as machines made out of sort of static materials. And this just kind of blows that up a little bit because these are very dynamic, energetically oscillatory packed things. And we're not alone in thinking that that tensegrity is a good way to look at biology, because we have now, unlike when I first started looking at this, we have research from the Wyss Institute at Harvard University, Stanford University, a lot of good research people from very conservative research backgrounds coming on board with it.
And this idea of push and pull, and tensions that are in this perfect balance dovetails wonderfully into singing.
Oh, for me, it's a very related thing. And I have a whole kind of little personal history with that, actually, if you want to hear about it.
Absolutely.
When I think about how I came to want to study biotensegrity, I have to trace it back to when I was a performing singer in the 80s and a voice teacher and a voice student at the Benjamin T. Rome School of Music at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. And at the same time when I moved to D.C., I started taking Tai Chi. When I started taking Tai Chi, there was a whole different way of looking at the body and movement that involved being relaxed and being in a dynamically kind of flow state internally. In a related practice, Bagua, there's even this idea of being externally stretched but internally gathered. So there's that push and pull again. And it changed the way I was singing. I would stand with a guitar and my knees would be locked, and I'd be trying to not move at all because I was afraid my fingers wouldn't hit the strings right. Once I learned about Tai Chi, I started to shift my weight and move my body, and everything changed. And that line from my book on biotensegrity that you were talking about in your podcast, um, everything moves. In the Tai Chi classics, it's when one thing moves, everything moves. And when one thing stops, everything stops. That's one translation. So I learned this way back then, but it didn't make any sense to me in terms of how do I apply it to my body. It was still a little mysterious. But if you think of it, if starting with the second part, one thing stops, everything stops. If you're trying to sing and then you say, lift your shoulder and make it really tight. And now try to say this, sing the same thing again. It's going to have an impact on what's going on. I mean, you could tighten your left hip or your right foot, it doesn't matter. But when you restrict something, there's a restriction that goes through the whole system. Only years later, studying biotensegrity, did I come to understand what they were talking about in the martial arts and what's going on in the whole body in terms of that interconnected, three-dimensional, dynamic web of push-pull movement.
And again, I think that that push-pull concept is so important because we very often hear about tension-free singing. And as I like to say, tension-free singing is silence. There has to be tension in the system, but the tension is within this balance. It has to have a counterbalance. When we lose that counterbalance and one tension begins to dominate, that's when we have problems. Yes?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, just look at a violin. It's because of the tension in the system, and not only the strings are tensioned, right? The neck is under tension, the wood is under tension. It's built to have those balances of forces of push and pull in such a way that it can resonate optimally. And I think you're right. We've kind of grown up learning tension to be a bad word. I've got a tension headache, but what's happening is that tension is the pull and compression is the push. And you really can't have one without the other. It's always going to be an interlinked set of properties. And so what can we do in our bodies to avoid, I think you put it well, any undue excess of tension, unneeded tension? We want to use it. It's powerful, and we want to learn how to use it just in the right amount. In a way, it's almost like cooking.
Absolutely. And speaking of ingredients, segue into fascia, this whole new area.
Yes.
I was introduced to your work by Jeremy Ryan Mossman, and he introduced me to this concept. What is fascia, and why should singers care about it?
This is another great question. And what's great about the question is that people don't even agree on the answer. Okay, so even within the very the community of people in the world that's really into studying fascia, a lot of movement teachers, manual therapists, they don't have agreement on what is fascia. So, but I will say that if you think of yourself as embryologically, from an embryological developmental perspective, you started as a one-celled organism. You became a multicellular organism. Those cells started differentiating. So this is what I mean when I say we're not like a machine where, the axle's coming from New Jersey and it'll be here Tuesday. It's not like that. We self emerge in our growing pattern from developmental beginnings. And then the fascia is that stuff that's interlinked and in between. Okay, so something while we're growing and differentiating, oh, this cell is going to become heart, this is going to become bone, this is going to become liver. While that's happening, something's keeping us all together as one and interlinking all through the system, through everything. And that is fascia. Now, that is a very lay term, that's not what, I'm not getting into all the chemical details, and the details of cytoskeleton and all of that. But just in general, it's that rather than thinking of the bones as our structure, right? Which it's not that they're not involved with that, because fascia is going through the bone as well. Think of this three-dimensional or multi-dimensional web of interlinked stuff that's under tension that facilitates communication, things like mechanotransduction. That's a new word in science, which is something happens here, the signal immediately goes to a very distant place. I would recommend, actually, David Lasondak's book, Fascia, What It Is and Why It Matters. And I would also recommend that people listen to the Radio Lab interview with Neil Thies on the interstitium, which came out a few weeks ago, because these are related things, and we don't even understand completely how they're related now. It's all so new.
But what we do know is it's not an inert substance.
At all, right? It's doing stuff. And
Profound
and
stuff.
Nature doesn't make unuseful things. Nature doesn't invest in waste. She's very efficient. And everything in us is doing all kinds of things. And everything in us is not only doing one thing, everything's multitasking, but in a coordinated, happy, win-win, energy efficient way. And the energy efficiency of the whole system of any living organism is part of why we know that when we're really wanting to sing well and sing long, relaxation has to be part of it, but not to the point of being a puddle on the floor. It has to be dynamic and tensioned in the right amount, not too much, that's a waste, but just the right amount. Some people in their vocal life, I mean, think of somebody singing in opera where they're doing many, many performances every week. You have to find a sustainable way to do it. And I think an understanding of biotensegrity for me is a key to why what voice people have already found works.
And I find for me, rather than thinking of myself as parts, right? It's been said we're not parts, but rather distinctions within the body. But just saying, oh, this muscle is tense, understanding that the fascia is all part of this, and the fascia can have different properties. It can be stiff, it can be more flowing, and it is to be able to find ways to allow that to get to more of a flow state. Something I have students do is I'll have them just bang their fingers into their palm and feel that resistance, and then gently but continuously press, and then they can go deeper and deeper and deeper as the fascia begins to give way. What are good ways to bring ourselves more into that flowing state?
I think that's a great point. Well, for one thing, I'll say that pain in the neck may have to do with something going on in your hip. We are interconnected. And one of the things I remember, a lot of people, when they start to sing, they're trying to sing from here. Okay, and it's true, the vibrations happen, in the throat, those oscillations, But if you put your thought and your energy and your force there, you're gonna hurt yourself. You have to sing with your whole body. What does that mean? And so I remember saying to people things like, okay, imagine you're singing, but the sound's coming out of the back of your knees, not your mouth. Now, what does that do to how you're going to sing? Imagine it's coming out of a little hole in the back of your neck. What does that do? You know, and to understand, and you can just play with any part of the body that way. And you can say, sing from your toes. Okay, what if the sound was squirting out your fingertips? What if the sound was coming in through your fingertips and coming out through the pores of your skin? When you can mine the metaphor and play with metaphor, you can move the mind to find new opportunities for exploration. And sometimes you can kind of unlatch from a habit that you've got about a way of thinking how things happen. I mean, nobody can get inside of you with a clipboard, John, and say, oh, look, when John sings, he's doing this, he's doing this. No. And it's different every time anyway, isn't it?
It is. And it's interesting because there was a time in my younger teaching days where I would have recoiled from these ideas of these metaphors and everything, because for me, everything, right, it was cause and effect. And this was drilled into me by the studies I was doing. And it was more of a machine model, if you will. And I think when we attempt to reduce things down to first principles, there is some value in that. But at a certain point, that's going to hit a wall. And the holistic act of singing is incredibly complex. But I think in order to unlock that complexity for yourself, I love this idea of experimenting with metaphor and imagery and mining it and then paying attention to what it's doing in the body. And I really feel that these other disciplines coming into singing are having a profound effect. And we had talked just before I hit record on so much of what we're learning is coming from movement training or sports research, because there's a whole lot more money in sports than there is in singing research.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, sports has a very organized system with a lot of money flowing through it at systemic levels, in a way that in the entertainment fields, for example, the wealth tends to be personal wealth when someone succeeds, and then only some of those people are going to think to go back and fund a research center for singing or something, you know.
Right.
And so I think you're right. And I think for me, that tensegrity model I was talking about functions as a metaphor for movement. You know, because I feel the unusual ways it behaves, which is helical, which is omnidirectional, and it helps me get into that holistic, whole self, non-machine kind of state of mind. And you're right that that urge to be scientifically sound, that's where that cadaveric research, you know, looking, you know, cutting up dead bodies and seeing what their throats look like and all of that, that it doesn't have no use. But we need to recognize the limitations of the use, because when a body is alive and functioning, it may look very different in there. And we know the fascia, if you look at Strolling Under the Skin, the work of Jean-Claude Guimberteau, you can see that right on YouTube. And you can see these fibers that are able to reconfigure endlessly and in very surprising ways, disappear, reestablish, relinquish again. This is the kind of multi-level, multi-dimensional reconfiguration ability that we have from the subcellular level right up to the whole organism. And we use every bit of it when we pull ourselves together, which I think metaphor helps with, so that we can sing or do anything.
Susan, where can people find out more about you?
I have done a lot of work on the Biotensegrity Archive YouTube channel. We've got hours of Biotensegrity party events that we started up at the beginning of COVID. My book is called Everything Moves, How Biotensegrity Informs Human Movement. It's got almost 100 experiential things, exercises, things you can do to learn through your body and your fingertips what we're talking about when we're talking about biotensegrity. And that's from Handspring Publishing.
Susan, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
My great pleasure.